Should the Jets give George Fant a contract extension? What to make of Denzel Mims? What to make of Joe Flacco? All of this and more on today's mailbag edition of the Locked On Jets podcast.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome, this is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Wednesday, August 3rd, 2022, and I'm your host, John B. from GanggreenNation.com. Thank you so much for making this show your first listen or your first watch every day. This show is free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. Big shout out to subscribers to this podcast. And to join that group, just hit the subscribe button wherever you are listening or watching. You'll get notifications as new episodes are posted, so you'll never miss an episode. If you're watching on YouTube, please give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps the channel out, and it helps other Jets fans find Locked On Jets. Today we have our weekly mailbag. Each Wednesday we try and do a mailbag as the schedule dictates. Sometimes we have to move it up to Tuesday. Sometimes we have to move it back to Thursday or Friday. But we try and do one mailbag each week with listener questions. Let's begin with a question from Joe. Would you re-sign George Fant now, or would you wait until he shows that he can sustain his performance from last year? That's a great question. I would be inclined to wait to see whether he could sustain his performance, because this is a guy who's 30 years old and a guy who, at this point, really has one quality season in the NFL. Now, Fant did show something in Seattle. He did improve steadily during his time with the Seattle Seahawks, but last year was his first quality year in the NFL from start to finish, I think. And there are excuses for Fant because he's new to the game. He's a guy who picked up football kind of late in his career in college and moved to tackle from the tight end position. So to the extent I can believe a late bloomer story, it's probably Fant because he was behind the learning curve when he entered the NFL relative to other players at his position. So normally I'd see a guy have a career year at 29 and I'd say there's no way he's repeating it. But with Fant, there has been kind of a steady upward trajectory to his career. That said, we don't know exactly what last year was for him. And when you look at the decision to make Fant the starting left tackle and Mekhi Becton the starting right tackle, there are so many different layers to it. And there are some layers that make me feel like this was a good move. There are other layers that make me feel like maybe it's not such a good move. I don't think that there is a definitive answer at this point whether or not it was the correct move for the Jets. I think that's something that will be determined over the months ahead. And one of the things we need to figure out is whether Fant is actually a quality left tackle in this league. Now, he looked like one last year. Can he sustain that level of play, though? To me, that's an open question. And just from the standpoint it's an open question, that means you should probably hold off. And it could be a situation like last year when John Franklin Myers got off to a great beginning to his season. And then, in October, you give him an extension. I think if Fant gets off, plays really well the first 4 or 5 games of the year, then you start having the discussion. But I don't think I'd commit to it, in part because I don't think you're really saving any money by waiting a month or two. I think that the price is probably going to be what the price is. So instead of locking yourself into a long-term deal and then having Fant regress, I think maybe you hold off and just confirm that what you saw last year was quality play. But the decision the Jets made, again, there are some areas where I think it makes sense. I mean, I kind of agree with Robert Saleh, and this was something I was kind of wondering as we were heading into training camp. Are you really going to move guys, shuffling guys back from left tackle to right tackle at the expense of gaining continuity on the offensive line? So from that standpoint, it makes sense. I know there are people out there who think Fant can only play left tackle, he can't play right tackle. I'm not a big believer in that, but that was another argument made. There are some question marks here, though, and Fant's contract status is one of them. He is going to be a free agent after this season, so instead of a potential hole at right tackle, if he leaves, then you have a hole at left tackle. And then are you getting into a situation where Mekhi Becton moves back to left tackle? Now, it's not the end of the world if that happens. Guys move back and forth on the offensive line all the time. I'm not saying it's going to destroy Mekhi Becton's career, but having a guy you drafted to be your left tackle and then playing him there the first year and planning to play him there the second year before he gets hurt, and then moving him to right tackle for a year and then moving him back the next year, that's not really an ideal development trajectory. Again, not necessarily a deal breaker, especially for somebody like Becton who moved back and forth in college, not just from year to year, but not just from game to game, but sometimes from play to play. When he was at Louisville, he'd move from left tackle to right tackle. So he's got experience at both spots, but In the NFL, it's a league, especially on the offensive line, where players tend to specialize at one spot. I mean, there's a reason the Jets kept Laken Tomlinson at left guard, where he's played most of his career, rather than moving to right guard like they initially said they were going to do. So, I mean, I don't think it's the greatest idea to do that. I don't think it's necessarily the end of the world, but the Fant situation kind of creates a conundrum for the Jets. And that's not saying that they've mismanaged it. It's just saying that this is a decision with some complexities, and there's no decision that's necessarily right or wrong. And I feel like anybody who's trying to tell you that Robert Saleh looks great because he made this move, or Robert Saleh looks terrible because he made this move, I think anybody doing that's kind of looking for a narrative right now, because there's a lot that's not known about how this is going to play out. I mean, the one thing I don't love about Fant is, to me, Fant is a really good bridge player. And I'm not talking about a guy who plays cards. I'm talking about somebody who is kind of a medium-term solution until you can upgrade on him. And I don't love the idea of having a guy who's just kind of a stopgap at the left tackle position, especially when you drafted somebody a couple of years ago who still hasn't failed out of the position. I mean, say what you will about Becton. His rookie year was pretty good. And the idea that you're going to commit to Fant long-term at left tackle, I mean, I think he's kind of like a Kelvin Beachum type player. You like to have him. I've said this many times when Kelvin Beachum was a member of the Jets. Having an awful left tackle can destroy your team. Just having a guy with credibility at the left tackle position, that really helps you out. Having no left tackle, I mean, your quarterback can be in some real trouble if that's the case, and your offense could be in some real trouble. So having a guy with some degree of credibility at left tackle makes sense, but that's also a position where I want to be great, because the guy he's blocking is the guy, as long as you got a right-handed quarterback, which the Jets do, the guy your left tackle is blocking is somebody your quarterback can't see. Your quarterback's not going to be able to step up in the pocket. It's not like the right tackle. The right-handed quarterback's going to be able to at least have some line of sight into who the right tackle is blocking. It's not the case at left tackle. So, listen, I'd rather have somebody like Fant or a Beachum opposed to a backup level player, but I really would like to be great there. And you look at Mekhi Becton. That's a guy who has the potential to be great. So from that standpoint, I think there are some question marks with this decision. Now, there are some things we don't know. Maybe the Jets just think Becton's a right tackle, which is entirely possible. And maybe they think he's just going to be a right tackle. And right tackles have plenty of value in today's league. So from that standpoint, maybe it's a good decision. Maybe the Jets just think Fant is a better left tackle than Becton. If that's also the case, then I guess it would be kind of disappointing, because they did draft Becton to be a left tackle, but again, it's not the end of the world. If Becton turns into a Pro Bowl right tackle, it's still an excellent pick. It's still a big win for the Jets. So I don't know that this is really a good answer to any of the question, but it's just a decision that has a lot of different elements, and there are a lot of unknowns right now, and I think we'll have a better idea by the end of the season whether or not the Jets made the right move here. And listen, at the end of the day, we're talking about where guys are lining up. It's not that big of a deal, but I don't know that we really have a firm grasp on things. The only thing I would say is I would wait a couple of weeks. I'd at least wait to see how Fant does early in the season. If he continues to play well, then I think that's the point where you talk extension, because at that point, I think based on what the Jets are doing, that the decision will be made. Becton's your right tackle of the future, and Fant will just be the left tackle the next couple of years. Our next question: what are your thoughts on the early Denzel Mims training camp buzz? Maybe he will bounce back in year 3 like May did. Well, I don't know that I love the comparison of Denzel Mims and Marcus May, because if you remember Marcus May, his second season back in 2018, he wasn't playing badly. He just kept getting injured. He couldn't stay on the field. I mean, when he was on the field in 2018, he actually played pretty well. It was just injury after injury after injury, and looking back, you have to remember he suffered the first injury the last game of his rookie season, and you wonder whether it was just a situation where he kind of got himself behind the 8 ball because he could not really train that summer, and things just kind of piled one after another after another. The other reason I don't think it's a great comparison is the Jets never thought about replacing May. May was always a starter. May was always a good player with them. When you look at what the Jets did this offseason, all right, so they obviously were bringing Corey Davis back. They were obviously bringing back Elijah Moore. They re-signed Braxton Berrios to a $6 million contract, and I know part of it's that Berrios is a return guy, but today's NFL, the value of the return game goes down each year. I don't think we're at a point, except for maybe somebody who's like Devin Hester, or like a Dante Hall if you want to go back far enough. Unless you have somebody of that quality as a return guy, which Berrios is a good return. He's not of that quality. I don't think you're paying him $6 million a year. So why are the Jets paying Berrios $6 million a year if return game isn't that valuable? Well, it's because I think they want him to be a big part of the offense, or at least a moderate part of the offense. But beyond that, they also drafted Elijah Moore, 10th overall, another wide receiver. And, I go back to this. Sometimes, coaches can say whatever they want. They can say, oh, I like this guy. I think he's going to be great. The way the team builds tells you a lot about what the coaching staff thinks of a player. And there's really not a spot for Mims in the lineup unless somebody gets injured. If the Jets had more confidence in Mims, I don't think that they would be looking to replace him. I think they would have left a spot where at least he could compete for a job. Maybe it'd be a situation where you bring back Keelan Cole as kind of your floor player. Okay, at least I'm getting a solid veteran there, and we'll give Mims a shot to compete for the job. The fact they did not do that kind of speaks volumes. And look, last year Mims was awful. I think we have this vision of Mims based on the player we thought he was going to be when the Jets drafted him in the second round in 2020. But you have to look at the results. He's been less productive his first 2 years than Stephen Hill was his first 2 years. Now, that doesn't mean he's as bad as Stephen Hill. It doesn't mean he's as irredeemable as Stephen Hill, but he's been a bad player. And just having a couple decent games. I know he had a couple decent games in 2020, and I put my hopes in that heading into last season. A lot of us did, but at some point, a couple decent games in 2020 doesn't mean anything in the grand scheme of things. I mean, there are plenty of failed players who had decent games at various points in their career. He's just been a guy who's been consistently not a difference maker. So what do we read into his training camp performance? Well, in all honesty, I don't know that I read a lot into it. He's doing it in training camp. He's doing it. Reports are he's in the third team offense. Yeah, I guess you'd rather see him perform than not perform, but I go back to what I always say. A couple of good practices? Would you care if you heard a guy had a great week of practice in October? No, so why do you care when it's happening in August? The preseason games may tell us a little bit more, but I just don't think you can read a whole lot into what Denzel Mims is doing. Now, ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we're only in August, but some Jets fans are trying to create a quarterback controversy. I've been asked whether Joe Flacco should have a chance of getting the starting job. I'll tell you what I think as we continue on this Wednesday mailbag Locked On Jets. Of course, here on this podcast, we talk about the NFL, we talk about the Jets, we talk about football, but at the end of the day, it's only a game. Your life is what matters, and it's really important to take care of yourself. It's really important to take care of your mental health. We're learning more about mental health every day, and you should know about BetterHelp. BetterHelp is not a crisis line. It's not self-help. It's professional therapy done securely online, available to people worldwide. You can log on to your account anytime and send a message to your therapist, and you can schedule a weekly video or phone session, so you don't have to be on camera if you don't want to. And getting therapy every week is as easy as a few clicks on your laptop or phone. With therapy, it can take a few tries to find the right fit, and BetterHelp makes it easy and free to change therapists if needed. It's more affordable than traditional offline therapy, and financial aid is available. BetterHelp is a great way to invest in yourself. You can visit their website and read their testimonials that are posted daily. In fact, so many people have been using BetterHelp that they're recruiting additional therapists in all 50 states. You shouldn't be afraid to get therapy. It's really helpful for a lot of people. I think that sometimes there's a hesitancy, but you should definitely figure out what works for you. And you should know that BetterHelp has a special offer for listeners of Locked On Jets. You can get 10% off your first month at betterhelp.com/lockedon. Again, that's 10% off your first month of online therapy at betterhelp.com/lockedon, LOCKEDON, one word. Thank you again for making Locked On Jets your first listener, your first watch every day. We're free and available on all platforms, continuing with our weekly mailbag. Joe Flacco is on such a good run in training camp that receivers don't even need to use two hands to catch his passes lately. See Elijah Moore. If this continues, should this be an open quarterback competition? Well, I give the fan base credit. We made it to August 3rd. We made it to week 2 of practice, and already people are trying to create a quarterback controversy. Listen, I'm always a believer that the better quarterback whoever the best quarterback on the roster is, should be the starting quarterback. And a lot of people disagree with that. They always think it should be the young quarterback. I think back to the Arizona Cardinals in 2007, 2008, when they had drafted Matt Leinart. And they had a guy, Kurt Warner, who seemed like he was near the end of his career. He had been in a big slump for a few years. Kurt Warner was the better quarterback, and he ended up getting the starting job over the young guy. The idea that you were going to develop him, and Cardinals almost won the Super Bowl, and they actually won the second division title with Kurt Warner at quarterback. That said, I do not think Joe Flacco is Kurt Warner. I think Joe Flacco's career is at the end. I don't think he's going to have a late career resurgence. I think back 10 years, and it's kind of amazing because Flacco's first 5 or so years in the NFL, he really looked like he was on a great trajectory, and he capped it with that Super Bowl win in 2012. And I thought, here we go. He's about to take the reins. Ray Lewis was retiring. Ed Reed was near the end of his career. Baltimore is going to start relying on Joe Flacco, and then it just never really happened for him. Pretty much the peak was the Super Bowl, and he had a really good year in 2014 when Baltimore hired Gary Kubiak as their offensive coordinator. But outside of that, the last 9-10 years have really been not very good for Flacco. And I think looking at this, based on, again, the last few years, Flacco's not really a guy you're going to win games with. Now, if Zach Wilson is not better than Joe Flacco right now, nothing really matters because the Jets aren't going to win games either way. But I think you have to put context into Flacco's performance in training camp. First of all, we're reading reports. We're not seeing what's actually going on out there. Second of all, I go back to I feel like I'm Allen Iverson on this show. We're talking about practice. We'll see what happens. But beyond that, Flacco's facing the second team, and he's at a big advantage. He's a 15-year veteran going up against really inexperienced guys who are backups in this. I know the Jets actually have some decent backups in the secondary, but backups nonetheless. And he's going to look great. And listen, I can tell you straight up, he's going to look great in preseason because he'll be going up against guys who are barely in the league. He's a 15-year veteran. He knows how to set the line. He knows how to do things. I don't know that he can win games for you against first-team defenses, though, against game plans. I think we're kind of past that point in his career. So, I mean, is Flacco better than Zach Wilson? I think if he is, that would say more. I hope not. I don't think I've seen any evidence to this point that was suggested to me. I mean, a couple of reports from practice. I need to see more from that. But I just don't think it serves the Jets any purpose to open this thing up. If you wanted to challenge Zach Wilson, you should have gotten somebody better. You should not have gotten late career Flacco. I don't think it's going to happen. I'm a big believer that the best quarterback should play, but if Flacco's the best the Jets can do, let's hope it doesn't come to that, because I have hope Zach Wilson could be better than Flacco. And if Zach Wilson isn't better than Flacco, it's going to be a very long year for the Jets. So let's not think in those terms. Let's think about some positivity. Our next question, is it time for us self-loathing Jets fans to admit that we finally have a good GM? Self-loathing Jets fans, that's what we are. I guess if we follow this team, we have to be a little self-loathing, don't we? I'm not ready to say Joe Douglas is a good GM yet. Good GMs are determined by the win-loss record. And I'm not going to hold the last couple of years against Joe Douglas. 19, it wasn't his team. 20, it really wasn't his team. Last year was kind of the year one of the rebuild. So I'm not going to say he's a bad GM because the Jets haven't won yet. But so we're in such a rush to crown people the next great guy. Let's see Joe Douglas's plan work. I think there's reason to be optimistic with Joe Douglas. I think if you want to say, I feel really good about the direction this team's heading in. I have a lot of optimism for what Joe Douglas is doing. I think Joe Douglas eventually will be a guy we call a good GM. I think that's fair. I think that I think that the Jets are done being the absolute bottom of the league. I think Joe Douglas has shown that he's competent enough that the Jets are not going to be the laughingstock of the league anymore. The question is how much better, because he's replacing Mike McCagnon. It can always get worse. I shouldn't say you could not get worse from Mike McCagnon, because you can always get worse in this league. If there's one thing this league has shown me, it can always get worse. But it would be really, 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 really hard for Joe Douglas to be worse than Mike McCagnon. And based on the plan I've seen, based on the moves he's made, I think the Jets are going to return to respectability under Joe Douglas. I don't have much doubt of that. I feel pretty confident saying the Jets will be a respectable franchise with Joe Douglas running them. The question is whether you get above respectability. Do you get to good? Do you get to where you're a championship level team? And that's unclear right now. I think the plan in broad strokes is very good. Again, I think if you want to say that you feel optimistic, if you want to say Joe Douglas has a good plan in place, you want to say you believe in Joe Douglas, you want to say a year from now we'll be saying Joe Douglas is a good GM, that's fair. I can't crown you, though, as a good GM until I actually see the results. You can't say that somebody's a good GM until they've actually built a team that's proven it can win. So that's where I go with it. I feel like I'm not self-loathing, so hopefully I'm a little bit more joyful than that. I think we'll get there. I think we can get there. I don't think we're there just yet, though. I think you got to everybody. I'm tired of the Jets being the off-season champion. Let's see the Jets win some games. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll talk about a position that could help the Jets win some games. That's offensive line. Should the Jets be done adding depth there? I'll tell you what I think as we continue on this mailbag episode. Ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we will talk about whether the Jets will upgrade their offensive line depth. Of course, during the offseason, they did upgrade their offensive line with the signing of Lake and Tomlinson, and that could translate to more wins this year. If you want to bet on some Jets games, BetOnline.net is the fastest and easiest way to check in on all your betting needs. You can find all of the latest sports and events at the #1 source for online odds, games, and lines. You can find reviews of every league. That includes not just the NFL, but it includes Major League Baseball, the NBA, the NHL, combat sports, esports, and even golf. BetOnline continues to be the top online resource for all of your sports wagering information. From live in-game betting, scores, and podcasts, they have you covered. You can head to BetOnline today or use your mobile device to learn more about the action happening today. You don't have to wait for the Jets. You can lay some money down on the games that are happening today. BetOnline, where the game starts. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Wednesday. We're doing a weekly mailbag show. Our next question: it was good to see the Jets improve their depth at linebacker last week. On offense, it looks like they still lack adequate depth on the offensive line. Are you satisfied with the Jets' depth at offensive line? If so, why? If not, what would you like to see the Jets do for offensive line depth at some point in the preseason? Well, I'm not pleased with the offensive line depth. I think that the Jets are going to have some trouble if they have an injury up front. But here's the thing. Offensive line depth is not easy to find in this league. Most teams lack it. So I can't criticize the Jets too heavily for it because there is a lack of quality offensive line play in this league. Listen, I look at the Jets a couple of years ago. Look at the guys they had starting for them, much less talking about depth. They had guys who really had no business starting in this league, holding down big roles for them. There is just a lack of quality on the offensive line. And, the Jets kind of lucked into Morgan Moses last year because he was a late cut and the Jets happened to have cap space. So it was kind of an odd situation. It was not the situation that's the norm. Really, all you can do is try and hit on some mid to late round picks. So I think Max Mitchell, the guy they drafted in the 4th round this year, guys like that are the players who have to step up because anybody who's good on the offensive line typically is going to get a starting job. There aren't enough good starting linemen in this league for every team to have a surplus. So, of course, you scan the waiver wire. Maybe some guy who's a quality player is a surprise camp cut. That happens from time to time. Sometimes it's a financial reason. Sometimes he just clashes with his coaching staff. Jets have benefited from those in the past. Pete Kendall, if you go back to 2004, he was a late signing, really helped the Jets stabilize their offensive line that year. But there's not a lot you can do outside of develop young talent. So, if you scan the waiver wire, maybe there's somebody who fits your scheme better than, if somebody gets waived, maybe he's just a bad fit for that team scheme. Maybe he fits the Jets scheme better. But, there are no obvious answers here. If there was an obvious answer, the guy probably would have been on the team already. And our last question, John, I remember a podcast you did in 2020 about fans losing interest in the team, and longtime fans are just not really caring about the team as much as they once did. Now I feel like we have a lot of buzz around the team. We have a lot of talent at several positions and a really young team. We have guys that are relevant to fantasy football even. Do you think this team can bring back genuine excitement to Jets fans and not just make us a fan base who loves misery? Well, the great thing about the NFL is that you always get another chance. Every 2 years or so, every 2-3 years, you get to reset your roster and take another swing at things. It doesn't matter if you failed 10 straight times doing it. All you need to do is get it right once. You look through the history of the league. Before the Steelers hired Chuck Noll decades ago, they were the laughingstock of the league. They were the worst franchise in the league, pretty much from their founding through the hiring of Chuck Noll. The Saints, prior to hiring Sean Payton back in 2006, had one playoff win through their whole career. And the Jets have a better history than either of those teams had prior to the point of getting the right people in place. So it's all a question of whether the Jets get the right people in place. You start winning games, everybody's going to come back, everybody's going to be excited, and it'll be very rewarding after what we went through. And look, at some point the Jets are going to figure it out. At some point this is going to be a better team. I hope it's this year. I hope it's this year or next year, but even if Joe Douglas doesn't work out, eventually they'll get the right people in place. It's only a matter of time. So I think fans will come back. I think, the 2020 was a rough year for the Jets. It was it was a rough year for everybody, but it was a rough year for the Jets. It was a situation where they had been doing things wrong for a really long time, and it really just kind of culminated in that disaster 2-14 season. But they've had a chance to clear everything out. They've had a chance to make this better, and I think there's a decent shot that we're going to look back and we're going to say this is the moment where the Jets finally got their act together. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Big shout out to subscribers once again. To join that group, just hit the subscribe button. You'll never miss an episode. If you're listening on a podcast source, please give it a 5-star review. It helps our channel out tremendously, as does giving this episode a thumbs up if you're watching on YouTube. I hope you have a great Wednesday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.